The sky over London wasn't blue, it was the colour of ash and forgotten promises. The city wheezed with every breath, its lungs clogged by coal smoke and the frantic heartbeat of machines. This was Victorian London, a place where time raced forward on iron tracks and chimney stacks, dragging millions behind it, coughing and hungry, into an age of industrial ambition. Smoke poured from every rooftop, staining bricks and skin alike. The Thames, once the lifeblood of the city, festered with filth and overflowed with the waste of a metropolis that had outgrown itself. London boomed, but it boomed unevenly, like a bell cracked in the casting. Beneath the grand facades of new banks and department stores lay an underworld of poverty so dense it threatened to collapse in on itself. The poor didn't live in London. They survived in it, pressed into crumbling buildings, hemmed into narrow alleys where the sun never reached, and forgotten by those who only saw the city from carriage windows. The population swelled like a blister, bursting past 2 million souls by mid-century, each one scrabbling for space, for work, for warmth. Rooms meant for 2 held 10. Streets groaned under the weight of bodies and refuse, indistinguishable some days. London had become a machine, but not everyone got to ride in the cab. The engine ran on coal and blood, and those at the bottom were both the fuel and the sacrifice. Children were born into this chaos, took their first steps in soot, and learned early to dodge the horse carts and the men with sticks. The lucky ones found work, the others found corners to beg in. There was no clean line between industry and misery. The factories that belched out prosperity also swallowed lives whole. Men lost fingers to machines. Women collapsed at looms. Boys crawled into dangerous places to keep the gears turning. And yet, in the glittering West End, there were operas and gas lamps and ladies in lace. London was a paradox wearing a top hat, refinement built on rot, culture floating above cruelty. The city itself became a kind of theatre. One side draped in velvet, the other hidden in shadows. It was all too easy to look away, to sip tea in Kensington while cholera crept through the East End, to debate poetry while a child drowned in a cellar during a flood of human waste. This is where the story begins, not with the grandeur of empires or the elegance of empire builders, but in the cracks between cobblestones, in the soot-covered faces of the unseen. Because to understand how the poor survived in Victorian London, you first have to understand the city that tried, every day, to swallow them whole. A baby born in the slums of Victorian London didn't cry for long, not because it was comforted, but because it was too weak. Hunger wasn't a condition here, it was a constant. It wrapped itself around the newborn, like the thin, soiled cloth that passed for a blanket, whispering a cruel welcome to the world. In the richest city on earth, thousands of infants entered life already condemned to fight for breath, for warmth, for a drop of milk that wasn't watered down or curdled. There were no sterile delivery rooms, no midwives with clean hands and calm voices, just crowded tenements, floors slick with filth, and the rasping breaths of mothers already worn down by poverty and birth after birth. Some children didn't make it to sunrise. Others died nameless, unrecorded, except in the sudden silence they left behind. Cradles were often nothing more than drawers or crates, and when there was no food, no medicine, no rest, what was a mother to do except wrap her baby tighter and pray they'd both wake up in the morning? The milk, if it came at all, came through breast or bottle, tainted by the mother's own malnutrition. Powdered substitutes were stretched with water drawn from pumps that ran brown or tepid. Diarrhea took many before they could even crawl. Doctors were too expensive, too far away, or too late. Churches offered prayers. Charities offered thin broth. But for most, there was no miracle coming. The grim arithmetic of infant mortality saw to that. In London's poorest districts, 1 in 3 children wouldn't live past their 5th birthday. Food was a luxury and often a lie. What passed for nourishment might be a crust dredged from a gutter or a spoonful of stew shared among 5 mouths. Mothers gave up their meals to feed their children. Fathers went hungry, drank instead, or disappeared altogether. A weak child might be called delicate by a hopeful parent, but everyone knew what that really meant. Not long for this world scurvy, rickets, wasting fevers. They were not rare afflictions. They were everyday companions, as familiar as the creak of the stairs or the scrape of the landlord's boot on the threshold. Still, they were loved, named with care, swaddled in what little could be found, cradled against hearts that beat fast with worry. In their eyes, some parents still saw hope, however fleeting. But the city didn't care. A child's laughter was rare, their cries too common to notice. And in a place where hunger never slept, being born meant only one thing: the fight had already begun. The slums of Victorian London weren't neighbourhoods, they were trapdoors. Once you fell in, climbing out wasn't just unlikely, it was almost unimaginable. St. Giles, Seven Dials, Bethnal Green, these weren't places people lived. They were places people survived. Streets didn't have names so much as reputations, whispered like warnings. Whole families were stacked like cordwood inside rooms, barely wide enough to stretch a body, their walls weeping with damp and their floors a tapestry of rot and rat droppings. There was no privacy, no fresh air, just the constant sound of coughing and the ever-present stink of too many lives crammed into too little space. Rookeries, they called them. Not because they were charming or quaint, but because they resembled nests of squawking, restless creatures, dark, entangled, and barely holding together. Each rookery was its own filthy ecosystem. The buildings leaned as if ashamed to be upright, their foundations eaten by time and sewage, cellars flooded with every rainfall, mixing human waste with the grey water from upstairs wash basins. Upstairs wooden stairs threatened to give way underfoot. Roofs leaked, walls sagged. Windows were luxury, broken ones more common. If light entered at all, it slanted in like an intruder. In these places, disease was not a visitor. It was the landlord cholera, typhus, diphtheria. They spread like whispers and stayed like curses. A single cough could echo across the hallway and be heard 3 rooms away, where another infant would wheeze in rhythm. Medicine cost money. Clean water was a rumour. Some rooms had no toilet, just a bucket emptied into the alley. The smell clung to everything: clothes, skin, dignity. Yet people lived here. Children were born. Meals, meagre as they were cooked and shared. People laughed, cried, grew old. And all of it happened under roofs that might collapse in a strong breeze. In Seven Dials you could turn a corner and disappear. The alleys bent like mazes. The buildings jostled against each other in a crooked embrace. And the people, hawkers, thieves, labourers, widows, moved like shadows, close to the wall and quick with their feet. Crime was common, but judgment was cheap. The real crime was that thousands were left to rot here, while wealth built marble theatres a few streets away. The rookeries didn't appear overnight. They were the result of decisions, or more often indecisions, of landlords who packed rooms tighter than prison cells, of city planners who looked away, of a society that measured worth in coin and lineage. No one chose the rookery. They landed there, fell into it, were born into it, and once inside, they learned quickly. The walls had ears, the floor had rats, and the rent came every week, paid or not. This was London beneath London, hidden in plain sight, where brick and bone decayed together, and where the poor learned to live in the cracks of empire. Waking up poor in Victorian London didn't mean the day began. It meant the debt resumed. Survival was an hourly calculation, a series of exhausting choices made before your feet even touched the damp floor. The fire was out, the air bit like teeth, and the coal bin was empty. Buying more meant pennies you didn't have, so you wrapped a child in a second shirt and prayed the frost wouldn't turn their breath ragged before breakfast. If there was breakfast, rent came first, always. The landlord didn't care about illness or winter or how many mouths you had to feed. He came with a hand out, and if you had nothing to give, he came next time with someone bigger. Rent was due weekly, collected with a glare, and it didn't matter if you were a shilling short. Rooms were measured not in square feet, but in bodies. How many could sleep on the floor? How many could sit without touching knees? Falling behind meant eviction, which meant the street, and the street meant nothing but cold, exposure, and the long, slow pull toward the workhouse. Coal cost money. So did candles, soap, bread, and whatever scrap of cloth passed for clothes. A penny here, a farthing there, every coin clung to like a lifeline. Families pawned boots for food, coats for coal, and memories for meat. You learned to stretch a halfpenny to its snapping point. You boiled bones twice. You watered milk until it was closer to regret than nourishment. If you were lucky, you found a butcher who sold scraps. If you were very lucky, you found them before the flies did. Children worked if they could, so did the elderly. No one was spared the daily scramble. Boys ran errands, sold matches, swept crossings. Girls helped launder clothes until their hands cracked open, or stood in markets selling wilted greens and yesterday's bruised apples. And when even that failed, you begged. Not with words necessarily, but with eyes. With thin limbs and visible ribs. Charity offered crumbs, a stale loaf here, a shared broth there. But pride was a luxury, and so was rest. Every hour not spent earning was an hour edging closer to hunger. Mothers went without so children could eat. Men worked until their backs bent. And still, the margin between life and starvation could vanish with one illness, one layoff, one missed rent. This wasn't living. It was enduring. It was surviving one cold night, one empty bowl, one tightened belt at a time. There were no savings, no safety nets, no breaks. The cost of staying alive was everything you had every single day. And tomorrow it would cost again. At the very bottom of Victorian London's great human ladder, beneath the street sellers and the chimney sweeps, beneath even the beggars and drunkards, lived the scavengers, the rag pickers, bone collectors, and ash sifters. They moved through the city like ghosts in daylight, their hands blackened with soot, their clothes reeking of decay, their eyes always searching. These were the ones who survived not by earning, but by picking apart the leftovers of a city too proud to look down. Rag-picking was a job only in the loosest sense. It required no tools but a sack, and no skill but desperation. Men, women, and children scoured the streets, gutters, and alleyways for scraps of cloth, old shirts, torn sheets, soiled dresses, that could be sold by weight to paper mills and textile dealers. Nothing was too filthy to pick up. A bloodied bandage, a lice-ridden shawl, a bit of curtain torn down from a fire-blackened room. It all had value if it could be weighed. Bones were another prize. Not meat, not marrow, just the dry, discarded skeletons of animals tossed from butchers' shops and back. Alley kitchens. Bone collectors roamed early before the sun and the competition, gathering dog skulls, chicken legs, and beef ribs with bare fingers. The bones were sold for their lime content, crushed into fertilizer, or used to make buttons and glue. If they smelled, you held your breath. If they were slick with rot, you wiped your hands on your trousers and kept going. Ash sifters combed through fireplace refuse, looking for anything that might have been burned incompletely. Bits of coal, charred nails, half-melted coins, if luck dared to show up. A day's haul might fill a bucket, and if you were lucky, it earned you enough for a crust and a candle stub. The dust coated your skin, settled in your throat, and followed you home like an unwanted pet. These workers had no shelter, no rights, and no pause. They walked miles each day with sacks over their shoulders, shoes worn to the sole or gone entirely. Children as young as 5 tagged along behind mothers with iron expressions, learning not just how to pick, but how to stay invisible to the law and the crueler sorts of men. It was a quiet, grinding life that left no record and earned no praise. They were not seen as workers. They were nuisances, dirty, shameful. Yet they kept the city cleaner than most would admit. They turned waste into worth, rot into coin. And though they lived on the edges of society, they were part of its foundation. Scavengers holding up the gleaming towers of industry by cleaning what others threw away. Their hands were always dirty, their work was always hard, and their reward most days was just one more day. She stood at the edge of the market with a baby on her hip and yesterday's bread under her arm, hoping no one would ask where her husband had gone. In Victorian London, a woman without a man wasn't just alone. She was exposed, widowed, abandoned, or never married at all. She was now someone the world stepped around or over rights. None to speak of choices. Fewer still, the city wasn't built for women like her. It was built on their backs, in their silence, and off their suffering. Our single mother might scrub floors until her knuckles bled, launder sheets that weren't hers to sleep in, or stand for hours in a line for work that paid in coins too small to feed 2 mouths. Day work was a lottery. Some found it. Most didn't. There were no safety nets, only judgment. People said fallen woman with a sneer, but never asked what pushed her off the ledge. Widows faced a different kind of cruelty. Their grief was expected to be quiet and their hunger quieter. A widow with children was often one illness away from the workhouse. Pensions existed only in the rarest of circles. For the poor, a dead husband meant lost income. And lost income meant you had to learn very quickly how to navigate a world that paid women half as much for twice the labor. Then there were the women who sold what no man would admit to buying. Sex workers, streetwalkers, unlisted and unspoken, but everywhere. They stood in the shadows of gas lamps or sat in gin houses, their faces painted with defiance or despair depending on the hour. Some had been seamstresses or servants. Others were born into brothels and knew no other life. The line between survival and ruin was thin, and for many sex was the last thing left to sell. It wasn't about desire, it was about bread rent. The child asleep 2 floors up, who still believed her mother worked nights as a cleaner. Respectability was a costume, and once it was torn, society rarely let a woman sew it back on. The law didn't protect them. The church pitied them, then turned away. Still, they endured. They formed bonds, loose webs of shared coin and secret help. A neighbor might share a crust. A friend might watch your child while you begged for work, or went out into the fog to meet a man who didn't want to know your name. There was no romance in their struggle, no Dickensian glow at the end of a hard day, just another dawn, another debt, another set of eyes looking past them. Women at the margins didn't survive because they were lucky. They survived because they had no other choice. And somehow, in the grime and silence, they kept going. The children of Victorian London weren't raised, they were weathered. They learned to crawl in soot, to walk on cobblestones, slick with refuse, and to run when the beadle came near. Childhood, if it ever existed for them, ended at the moment they could carry a bucket, hold a broom, or fit into a chimney flue. Play was a luxury, school was a dream, work was life, and for the poorest, there was no question of whether they should work. Only when, how, and whether they'd survive it. Crossing sweepers were the most visible. Small figures with brooms too large for their hands, they darted out before carriages to clear paths through horse dung and mud. A swept crossing might earn a penny, or a kick, sometimes both. It depended on the mood of the man in the top hat or the woman with lace gloves. You had to smile, you had to bow, you had to be invisible and grateful all at once. The wrong word could cost you your earnings. The wrong gesture could cost you your teeth. Then there were the chimney sweeps, boys no older than 6 or 7, their ribs showing beneath their shirts, their bodies twisted from years of climbing through soot-filled shafts. Master sweeps fed them little and beat them often. If they got stuck, they were jabbed with sticks. If they cried, they were mocked. Many didn't make it past adolescence. Lungs blackened, knees shredded, eyes dimmed by smoke and beatings. And still mothers sent them, because the coin they brought home kept the family from the workhouse. Mudlarks scoured the banks of the Thames, their bare feet caked in river filth, searching for anything that could be sold, bits of rope, nails, coins, scraps of metal. The river was cold, it stank, it swallowed children whole when the tide turned fast. But it was a job. In a city of millions, being useful, even to the river, was better than being nothing. Some sold matches, some sold flowers, or old newspapers, or themselves. Others simply begged with wide eyes and clever lines, trying to soften the hearts of passers-by, who usually just looked past them. The streets were their home, their school, their workplace. Danger waited around every. So did the men who took advantage of children with no one to protect them. And yet they lived, they sang, they formed gangs, made jokes, stole bread. They learned to run fast, to sleep light, to spot kindness when it flickered. The children of the gutter were many things, dirty, loud, wild, but never weak. They couldn't afford to be. In a world that offered them nothing, they learned to take what they could, 1 penny at a time, 1 breath at a time, 1 impossible day at a time. For the poor of Victorian London, the word workhouse carried the weight of a threat. It was a last resort, a place spoken of in low tones and entered only when all other options, begging, scavenging, borrowing, had collapsed. To go to the workhouse was to admit defeat, to sign away freedom in exchange for bread and shelter. It was, in theory, a lifeline. In reality, it often felt like a slow burial. The system was meant to help, at least on paper. Parishes offered relief to those who could no longer survive on their own. But help came with conditions, and the cost of aid was steep. Upon entry, families were separated. Men from women, parents from children, husbands and wives who had clung together through freezing nights were now torn apart by iron rules. Children who had never known a night away from their mother's side were marched into dormitories and told not to cry. The cruelty wasn't an oversight. It was design. The workhouse was meant to be harsh, so only the truly desperate would enter. Inside, the days were long and regimented. Wake at dawn, work until dusk, meals of gruel, bread, and occasionally something passing for broth. There was no rest, no privacy, and no softness. Tasks were deliberately exhausting, breaking stones, picking oakum, scrubbing endless floors, and always under the gaze of officials whose job was not to care, but to control. The poor weren't just fed, they were corrected. Disease stalked the corridors. So did hopelessness. People wasted away in those places, their names slowly forgotten even by the world outside. The lucky ones emerged after a few weeks or months, bones sharper, eyes duller, a small coin in their hand, and a little shame clinging to their clothes. Most never returned, not because they rose from poverty, but because they'd rather starve on the street than feel the workhouse door shut behind them again. And yet the threat of the workhouse loomed over every decision the poor made. It was the end of the road. The cruel reminder that there was always a worse place to fall. Even those who mocked or feared it still used it as a shadow in conversation. We'll be in the workhouse by winter, as if speaking it aloud made it less likely to come true. It's easy, from a distance, to say it offered shelter, a roof, a meal. But for those who knew it from within, the workhouse wasn't salvation. It was surrender. It was the final chapter in a life already stripped bare. And for many, it didn't just steal comfort. It stole dignity. For the poor of Victorian London, food wasn't about flavour. It was about survival, something to fill the void, warm the belly, and buy just a few more hours before hunger returned. Kitchens were rare, stoves were luxuries, the street was the table, and the meal, if you could call it that, was whatever you could afford, find or beg. Penny dinners were salvation for many. For a single copper coin, you might get a bowl of stew, watery, pale, mostly turnip if you were lucky, or a scoop of boiled rice swimming in a grey puddle of broth. Meat was more suggestion than substance. Still, it was hot, and it was something. Churches and charities ran the kitchens, and long lines of ragged coats and worn shoes stretched down the street each evening. Children and mothers waiting patiently for their turn. It wasn't pride that brought them there. Pride had been swallowed days ago, along with the last crust of bread in the house. Street vendors filled in the rest. Eel pies were common, cheap, slimy, but filling jellied eels. For those with stronger stomachs, hot pies for those with a spare coin. The crusts were thick, the fillings questionable, but they were warm, and they stuck to your ribs. For a farthing or two, a vendor might sell you a hunk of bread soaked in hot beer, soft and bitter, but more digestible than dry crust alone. Others sold offal, organs and scraps the butcher wouldn't display fried in lard and wrapped in paper. The smell was strong, the taste secondary. Roasted chestnuts warmed fingers before they filled stomachs. Sheep's trotters, dripping with fat, could be gnawed on for hours. And then there was peas pudding, thick and bland, but better than nothing. The streets near markets were best, where discarded vegetables might be scooped up before the rats got to them, where bones might still carry a bit of meat, where a bruised apple could pass for dessert. Children often fended for themselves. A halfpenny bought a scoop of pudding or a handful of sweets too rough for the upper class. They gathered around stalls, eyes wide, hands dirtied with grease. Older boys might nick a crust or a potato, run down the alley before the shout came. Sometimes the shopkeeper let them go. Sometimes he didn't. But no one ate well. Even the full stomachs were uneasy. Food was a gamble, spoiled, contaminated, or just enough to keep the fever away. Illness often followed a bad meal, and food poisoning didn't care how hungry you were. Still, in the cold and noise, around flickering gas lamps and coal smoke, the scent of something cooking brought people together. It was brief, but it mattered. For a few minutes, the belly stopped aching. For a few bites, the city felt less cruel. Penny dinners didn't save lives in the grand sense. But they let people carry on, and sometimes that was enough. In Victorian London, charity walked a crooked line between compassion and control. For the poor, it was rarely a gift. It was a judgment wrapped in good intentions. Christian missions handed out soup and sermons in equal measure. Middle-class ladies visited tenement rooms with baskets of bread and eyes full of pity. And always there were strings. To accept help often meant accepting humiliation, lectures, and the heavy weight of someone else's virtue. The missions came first, driven by a belief that poverty wasn't just unfortunate, it was sinful. To be poor was to be spiritually lost, and to be helped, one had to be saved. Soup kitchens fed the belly, but only after feeding the soul. Prayers were not optional. A sermon might come before a meal, a hymn before a coat. Bibles were given out with blankets. And if you didn't bow your head, if you didn't show the right kind of gratitude, the door could quietly close in your face. Philanthropy followed, often well-meaning, but just as often blind. Middle-class reformers wrote books about the condition of the poor after spending an afternoon in a slum. They toured rookeries as though visiting a zoo. They described the smell, the filth, the hopelessness, then returned home to parlours warmed by coal fires, content that their 5-shilling donation had purchased moral satisfaction. They spoke of lifting the poor up, but rarely knelt down beside them. Some did care deeply. Some gave time, money, even dignity, but many others came only to instruct. How to keep house, how to cook, how to behave. Mothers were told they were lazy. Fathers were told to stop drinking. Children were taught obedience first, then scripture. Cleanliness became a moral issue. If your shirt was torn or your floor unswept, it was proof not of struggle, but of failure. Charity schools offered learning, but expected gratitude in return. Clean hands, combed hair, quiet voices. The poor had to present themselves as worthy, not just in need, but humble, modest, penitent. It wasn't enough to be starving. You had to starve the right way. And still many came, because pride was brittle and hunger relentless, because even a lecture came with a slice of bread. Some learned how to nod at the right time, how to say thank you through clenched teeth. Others bristled and turned away, choosing the cold honesty of the street over the polished cruelty of good intentions. Help in Victorian London often came not with an open hand, but with a pointed finger. It lifted a few, it shamed many, and it reminded the poor daily that even when mercy knocked, it expected to be admired. In the alleys and fog of Victorian London, crime wasn't always a choice. Sometimes it was simply what was left, when work paid pennies, if it paid at all, and food prices climbed faster than wages. The line between criminal and survivor blurred until it almost vanished. For thousands scraping by in the slums, theft wasn't rebellion. It was arithmetic. A loaf stolen meant a stomach fed. A pocket picked meant rent for the week. And for many, prison was cleaner and warmer than the room they came from. Children learned early. Gangs of street urchins moved like shadows through the markets, eyes sharp, fingers quicker. A distracted gentleman meant a coin purse gone. A busy stallholder meant an apple slipped into a pocket. Fagin might have been fiction, but his world wasn't real. Life fences thrived in back rooms, buying stolen handkerchiefs, pocket watches, silk scraps. The older ones trained the younger, how to distract, how to vanish, how to look harmless. If you were clever, you earned more than your father ever could digging ditches or hauling bricks. Women played the game too. Some lifted goods from market stalls with babies in their arms, an innocent look, a soft hand, a cabbage tucked beneath a shawl. Others worked as confidence tricksters, baiting lonely men with smiles before leading them into alleyways where accomplices waited. A pretty face could be as valuable as a swift hand. Beauty and desperation made for a dangerous combination, and the city never ran short of either. There were gangs, certainly. Hardened men who robbed warehouses or burgled shops by night. But for most, crime wasn't organized, it was improvised. The trick was not getting caught. The courts were ruthless. A man could be sentenced to months for stealing bread, A child to years for taking a handkerchief. Petty crime carried heavy weight, and repeat offenders found themselves shipped to far-off penal colonies or locked in the hulking skeletons of London's prisons. Still, people returned to the streets, because the alternative was slower, more humiliating, more uncertain. Picking pockets might get you jail. Starvation would get you nothing. Even among the honest poor, there was a certain grim respect for a thief who could feed his family. You couldn't eat virtue, and no landlord ever accepted morality in place of rent. London judged its criminals harshly, but rarely asked where they came from. What it felt like to wake cold and hungry for the 100th day. What it did to a person to see the rich walk past in carriages, never once meeting your eye. In a city built on fortunes, those without one learned quickly, crime wasn't always about greed. Sometimes it was just the only door left, and stepping through it was less about defiance than survival. In the slums of Victorian London, illness wasn't a surprise. It was an expectation. Coughs echoed through damp cellars. Skin turned pale and sunken long before a doctor ever arrived, if one arrived at all. Sickness clung to the air, to the water, to the very bricks that sweated with rot. There was no silence without a wheeze, no night without a fevered moan from the next room. The poor didn't ask if they'd get sick, only when and how badly. Tuberculosis was everywhere. Consumption, they called it. A slow unravelling of lungs and flesh. It hollowed out the chest, painted cheeks with a false bloom, and left blood on the pillow. It passed easily in cramped rooms where air never moved, where entire families slept side by side. Children wasted away before their first birthday. Mothers coughed through their labour. Death didn't knock in these places, it let itself in. Cholera struck harder and faster. It came in waves, carried by water no one could afford to boil. A sip from a public pump, a drop from a cistern shared by dozens, and within hours the stomach twisted, the body emptied itself, and hope vanished. Entire streets could fall ill in a day. Those strong enough to stand dug the graves, and always there was typhus, dysentery, smallpox, diseases born of filth and too many bodies packed too close. A cut on a child's foot could fester into fever. A broken finger left untreated might end in amputation. Rats carried more than fleas. Water carried more than thirst. Doctors existed, but not for the poor. A visit cost money. Medicine cost more. Most turned to home remedies, whispered advice, or the apothecary with his dusty bottles and guesswork potions. For the desperate, there was opium, cheap, numbing, and dangerously easy to give to crying babies who wouldn't sleep in the cold. It calmed the pain, dulled the hunger, and all too often stopped the breath. Charitable hospitals began to rise as a lifeline, built by those who saw too much suffering to ignore. St. Bartholomew's, the Royal Free. They offered care without coin, but even charity had limits. Beds were few, rules were strict. Patients were sometimes turned away not for lack of need, but for lack of space. Still, they came, hobbling, fevered, sometimes carried. The halls smelled of carbolic and despair, but they offered a chance. And that was more than most had. The city moved on, even as the sick lined its gutters and filled its burial grounds. Health was a luxury, bought with clean water, warm food, and private rooms. The poor had none of these. They had resilience. They had pain. And they had each other. In the end, they endured not because they were strong, but because they had no choice but to keep breathing, one ragged breath at a time. In a city where poverty loomed like fog, the idea that a child might learn to read was almost radical. For the poor of Victorian London, education was often a dream whispered in doorways, something promised to others somewhere else. Work came first. Survival always took priority. But even among soot and sickness, a quiet revolution stirred. It came in the form of chalkboards, worn benches, and volunteers who believed that knowledge could be a rope to climb out of the gutter-ragged schools they were called. The name fit. The children who attended wore coats held together with string, shoes with more holes than leather, and faces hardened by cold mornings and skipped meals. Some came from the streets, others from cellars and attics where families huddled together like forgotten things. Most had never held a book. Many had never held a pencil. Yet they came, drawn by something just beyond hunger. Hope the schools didn't charge. They couldn't. A penny was too dear for a family that chose daily between coal and bread. Instead, they opened their doors with nothing to offer but warmth, patience, and the promise of letters on a page making sense one day. Lessons were basic reading, writing, arithmetic, but they were delivered with care, and in that care was something new, dignity. Teachers were often volunteers, clergy, reformers, women from better neighborhoods who believed change began in classrooms, not courtrooms. They taught not just words, but discipline, curiosity, kindness. They faced chaos, fights, shouting, children too tired to keep their heads up. But they returned day after day because somewhere in that noise was the future. For many children, these rooms were the first places they were ever listened to. The first time someone said their name not as a warning, but as an invitation. Some stayed only a week. Others stayed long enough to write their own name, to read a sign, to count their earnings. A few, just a few, moved beyond even that. Apprenticeships, trades. Letters sent back to the school years later, signed by hands that had once trembled holding chalk. The schools didn't end poverty. They couldn't erase the factories or the slums, but they carved small spaces in the stone walls of fate, cracks wide enough for a child to slip through and maybe, just maybe, climb. They taught that ignorance wasn't destiny, that intelligence wasn't owned by the wealthy, that even a child from the gutters might grow up to speak, to think, to be heard. In the grim machinery of the city, ragged schools were a soft defiance, not a revolution, not a miracle, but a second chance offered quietly to those who had never been given a first. In the narrow lanes of Victorian London, where chimney smoke curled through broken windows and hunger lived in the walls, faith became a thread that held many together. Religion wasn't just found in chapels and cathedrals. It was in whispered prayers before sleep, in hymns sung over empty tables, in the sermons shouted from soapboxes at the edge of the market. For the poor, God was both a comfort and a question. Why so much suffering? Why so little relief? And yet, still they believed, because sometimes belief was all that remained. The church loomed large in the lives of the destitute, but not always as a sanctuary. For some, it was a finger pointed in judgment. Moral failure, they said, brought poverty, drink, laziness, sin. It was easier to blame than to feed. Preachers spoke of eternal reward, but asked for discipline now, obedience, cleanliness, humility. Religion, in these forms, became another set of rules the poor had to follow just to be seen as worthy of help. And yet, there were also places where faith felt like warmth, instead of a warning. Small mission halls lit by gas lamps and crowded with voices, chapels where the preacher's shoes were as worn as the congregation's, and his words came not from a place of superiority, but of shared struggle. In those moments, religion did more than scold. It soothed, it gave shape to suffering. It promised that pain wasn't the end. Hymns carried through alleyways, sweet and aching, often sung louder than the belly's growl. They became a kind of protest, gentle, mournful, defiant. Children learned them before they learned to read. Women sang them while scrubbing steps or rocking babies who didn't have enough milk. Songs like "Abide with me" or "Nearer, my God, to thee" floated from lips cracked by cold but lifted by hope. For many, Sunday was a break from the relentless toll of survival. You wore your best. Even if your best was mended twice over, you walked to the church with your head held higher. For a little while, you were more than your hunger, more than your debts. You were part of something sacred, but faith could also be a leash. Some institutions tied their charity to scripture, their help to your behavior. To receive a coat, you might first have to endure a lecture. To eat, you might have to pray the soul they believed had to be saved before the body. And for the poor, that meant grace always came with conditions. Still, the slums carried more faith than many would ever see. It lived in the lighting of a candle, in the clutch of a hand during grief, in the firm belief that something, someone was watching, listening, caring. In a city where the powerful often passed by with blind eyes, many turned to heaven because it was the only place that hadn't turned away. Laughter in the slums of Victorian London was not light or careless. It was cracked and worn, the kind that slipped out between missing teeth and bruised ribs, but it was real, and in a world thick with soot and sorrow, it mattered. Entertainment, no matter how crude or cruel, offered escape. Not from poverty itself, but from the weight of it. For a few coins, or sometimes none at all, the poor could step into a darker, stranger world and forget their own for an hour. Penny gaffs were the theatres of the gutter, ramshackle halls tucked behind shops or above pubs, where wooden benches creaked under the weight of factory hands and barefoot children. The air stank of tobacco and damp wool, but the stage was alive. Cheap dramas played out with wild gestures and louder voices. Villains, ghosts, crooked judges, and brave paupers, who always won in the end. There were no fine costumes, no clever effects, just candlelight and sweat, and the roar of a crowd that knew every twist before it came, but cheered anyway, because they weren't clapping for the story, they were clapping for the feeling. Then there were the freak shows. Painted signs promised wonders, bearded ladies, giants, human skeletons, tattooed men from lands no one had seen. The crowds came not out of cruelty alone, but curiosity, hunger, boredom. Life was hard and ugly already. Staring at someone stranger than yourself could feel like proof that, for once, you weren't the worst off. And for the performers, many of whom had nowhere else to go, it was survival too. They earned a wage, however small. They made a place in a world that had pushed them to its margins. The music halls were brighter, louder. There were comic singers, acrobats, bawdy jokes that had the mothers blushing, and the fathers howling beer flowed. The laughter did too. It was raw, full of filth and fury, but it was real release. In a city that looked down on the poor from every window and carriage, these halls let them laugh back. At the bosses, at the law, at death itself. Even in the streets there was theatre. Punch and Judy shows on the corner. Organ grinders with monkeys in waistcoats. Fire eaters, strongmen, dancing girls with skirts that twirled too high. Every corner could be a stage. Every step a moment away from something strange, something delightful, something not meant for survival but for the soul. It didn't last. The cold came back, the hunger, the bills. But for a few precious moments, surrounded by smoke and noise, the poor could feel rich in spirit. They could laugh until their sides ached and the tears ran down their cheeks. Not from pain this time, but from joy. And in a life where so much was stolen, that joy, ragged, fleeting, but real, was everything. They woke before the sun, moved through the fog like ghosts, and disappeared again by nightfall. The city never noticed their names, only their hands. Hands that scrubbed, lifted, stitched, hammered, bent into shapes that matched the tools they carried. The poor of Victorian London didn't just suffer. They worked, and they worked hard. In basements, in alleys, behind the clamour of progress, they kept the city alive while barely surviving themselves. Take the laundry women, their backs bent over boiling tubs, arms raw from scrubbing collars that belonged to men who wouldn't meet their eyes in the street. They stood in steamy rooms, heavy with soap and sweat, scrubbing filth from fine shirts they'd never afford. It wasn't noble work. It wasn't respected. But it paid, just enough to buy bread and coal and to return the next day with hands red and blistered. The costermongers were everywhere, pushing handcarts down crowded lanes, shouting over the noise of hooves and chimneys. They sold fruit bruised at the market's edge, wilted flowers, cracked crockery, anything that could be bought cheap and sold cheaper. They were hawkers, hustlers, salesmen of the street. Rain didn't stop them, nor did frost. Their voices became part of the city's music, loud and desperate and full of life. At the docks, men waited in line before dawn, hoping to be picked for a day's labour. There were no contracts, no guarantees, just a nod from the foreman and a scramble for crates to carry. It was back-breaking work, loading, unloading, lifting, until your arms gave out, and when the shift ended, they were forgotten until the next morning. When the line formed again in the cold, in the factories the air was thick with dust and danger. Children crawled under machines still running. Women stitched for 12 hours a day, eyes burning, spines twisted into permanent ache. There were no brakes, no protections, just the rhythm of the machines and the knowledge that if you stopped, someone else would take your place. The poor didn't power London's industry. They were the industry, spinning thread, stamping tin, dying young, yet they were invisible. Their names weren't printed in newspapers. Their deaths weren't mourned by the city they served. They weren't honoured with statues or praised in Parliament. They were the hands that fed the machine, the bodies that filled its cracks. And without them, the carriages wouldn't roll, the lamps wouldn't light, the rich wouldn't dress, and the empire wouldn't grow. But still, they were never seen. This was the bargain, anonymous labour for invisible survival. They worked not for pride or progress, but because there was no other choice, and they carried the weight of the city not on their shoulders, but in the silence of their forgotten names. At first there was only silence. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. The poor of Victorian London had been taught to bow their heads, to take what work they could get, to whisper their complaints behind closed doors, if they dared voice them at all. But under the soot and strain, something was beginning to stir, slowly, painfully, like a muscle that had long been still. It started with a murmur, then a march, then a shout that could not be ignored. By the mid-1800s, the weight had become too much. Wages barely scraped against the cost of food. 10 whole days stretched into 12. Hands bled, backs broke, and still there was no relief. Employers called it progress. Workers called it survival, until survival became resistance. The early unions were fragile things, often illegal, always watched. But they were born from shared misery and kept alive by a stubborn refusal to be crushed entirely. Dock workers, match girls, tailors, carpenters. They began to speak not just for themselves, but for one another. They gathered in dim rooms, passing cups of tea and lists of grievances. They knew the risk to protest was to be fired, blacklisted, possibly jailed, but the alternative was silence, and silence had never fed a child. Some of the earliest strikes were small, scattered, broken before they began, but others caught fire. The match girls' strike of 1888, young women who packed phosphorus into boxes and lost their teeth to its poison, walked out in protest, demanding safety and dignity. Their victory was modest in scale, but enormous in meaning. It proved that the powerless weren't helpless, that a group of working-class girls could look a factory owner in the eye and say enough. Meetings turned to marches. Banners were raised. Songs were sung. Protesters flooded Trafalgar Square and East End streets, some waving signs, others simply walking because they had no other tools to fight with. And the world noticed, slowly, grudgingly, laws began to shift. 10 whole workdays became the norm. Safety regulations were whispered about in Parliament. Employers began to fear not just economic loss, but public shame. But it was never easy. Police batons swung freely. Protesters were arrested. Newspapers painted them as troublemakers. Still they came back, because by then they had found something deeper than wages. They had found a voice, and once heard, it could not be buried. The early labour movement didn't fix poverty. It didn't banish hunger or cure the diseases of the slums. But it cracked the foundation of a system built on silent suffering. It taught the poor that they were not alone, that unity was strength, and that even in a city built to forget them, they could still force it to listen. In the autumn of 1888, the alleyways of Whitechapel bled fear. The killings were not the first in London, nor would they be the last. But something about these murders, their brutality and their precision, forced the city to look where it had long refused to, into the heart of its own neglect. Jack the Ripper didn't just kill women. He exposed a truth more terrifying than any knife. How easy it was for the poor to vanish without anyone noticing, until their bodies were laid out in the street. The East End had always been whispered about, a place of shadows and sin, of sweatshops and gin palaces, of desperation too loud to ignore but too uncomfortable to confront. It was seen as another world, foreign to the parlours and gaslit boulevards of the West. When the murders began, many outside the slums treated them like grisly theatre, blood in the gutter, mystery in the fog. But inside Whitechapel, there was no thrill, only terror. The victims were women, poor and middle-aged, many working the streets, not by choice, but by hunger. They had names, Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary, Jane, but to the city they were types, not people. Prostitutes, said the papers. Fallen women, easy targets. But the Ripper didn't choose his victims for their sins. He chose them for their vulnerability, for their isolation, for the fact that they lived in corners no one watched and slept in rooms no one guarded. As the bodies piled up, so did the questions. Why were these women walking alone at night? Why had they turned to street work? And slowly, uncomfortably, some began to answer. Because their husbands had died, because they had children to feed, because the workhouses were worse than the streets, because poverty left no gentle options. The slums weren't breeding grounds for evil. They were open wounds that festered in silence. The police, overwhelmed and ill-equipped, stumbled. The killer vanished like smoke. And in his absence, the panic grew. Respectable London could no longer pretend the East End didn't matter. Headlines screamed. Politicians postured. Suddenly, poverty wasn't just tragic, it was dangerous. Fear, at last, made the invisible visible. But the Ripper didn't reform the city. He didn't bring justice or peace. What he did was hold up a mirror to a society that had let entire neighbourhoods rot under the weight of neglect. And in that mirror, the upper classes saw something they hadn't expected. Their own complicity. The murders stopped, but the fear lingered. Not just of violence, but of what lay beneath the cobblestones. The stories ignored, the women forgotten, the lives weighed and found wanting. Jack the Ripper was never caught, but the world he hunted in, that crumbling gaslit underworld, was real, and it belonged to the poor long before his name ever stained its streets. In the slums of Victorian London, survival was rarely a solo act. When the state looked away and charity came with strings, the poor turned inward to each other. Beneath the soot, blackened bricks and crumbling stairwells, something stubborn endured. It wasn't money, it wasn't comfort, it was connection. A quiet, defiant solidarity that didn't make headlines, but kept people alive. Neighbours shared more than walls. They shared coal, bread, and borrowed time. A mother, with too many mouths to feed, might find a hunk of stale bread left at her door. No note, no boast, just help. When someone fell ill, others stepped in. One woman watched the children. Another fetched water. No one had enough. Yet somehow there was always a little to give. Misery didn't divide them. It wove them tighter. Informal economies flourished in the cracks left by neglect. A man fixed boots from a stall made of crates. A widow sold buttons or lace from a blanket on the pavement. Soap made in a tin bathtub. Meat pies sold from a basket. Mended clothes exchanged for eggs. It was barter. It was hustle. It was economy stripped of gloss, built on favours, grit, and mutual need. Women formed their own networks, watchful, whispering webs of knowledge and care. They knew whose husband drank too much, whose child had the cough, who needed looking after. Midwives delivered babies in damp back rooms, more skilled than many doctors. Old women with bitter herbs and steady hands cured fevers and eased pain. These weren't institutions, they were lifelines. Even lodging houses, packed and loud and often grim, had their rhythms of care. A few pennies meant a spot on the floor, and if a regular was short, someone might cover the gap. There was cruelty, of course, jealousies, theft, violence, but there was also kinship, a sense that in a world rigged against them, their best chance was each other. When funerals came, and they came often, the poor still found ways to honour the dead. A past hat, a pooled shilling, a neighbour's spare black shawl. No one wanted to see their kin lowered into the ground without dignity. Grief was communal, and so was the burden it brought. This was a different kind of strength, not loud, not noble in the way papers liked to describe charity. It didn't come from pulpits or parliaments. It came from hunger met with kindness, from dirt-smeared hands offering bread, from eyes that saw suffering and didn't turn away. In the end, the poor endured not just through labour or luck, but through each other. In their own broken way, they built a net no one else had bothered to weave. And though it frayed, though it stretched near breaking, it held quiet, invisible, strong. The fog has long since lifted from the alleys of Victorian London, but its echoes still linger. The soot has washed from the bricks, the horses have gone, and the gas lamps burn no more. But the weight of that poverty, of that century of survival in the shadows, hangs in the air like something unfinished. We tell ourselves the world has changed, and in many ways it has. But beneath the glass towers and clean pavements of our modern cities, the same patterns press on, worn in different shapes. The slums of Whitechapel are gone, bulldozed and rewritten, but their descendants walk among us, families crushed by rent, workers exhausted by hours that stretch longer than laws allow. Food banks stand now where soup kitchens once did. Tenements have become tower blocks. The language has softened, but the story is not so different. The poor still carry cities on their backs, still vanish behind the noise, still reach out to one another when no one else will. But something else survives too. Something harder to see, but just as real resilience. The kind forged in basements and back streets, in mothers who fed 5 children with 1 loaf, in children who learned to read by candlelight, in hands that blistered and bled and still reached out to lift others. The dignity of the poor was never granted to them. It was carved from hardship, one small kindness at a time. Reform came slowly, too slowly, and often only after tragedy. Ragged schools grew into public education. Labour laws inched forward, pulled by protest. Sewers replaced open drains. Workhouses fell into disrepute, but each step forward came at a cost, measured not in pounds, but in lives. In the girls who struck for safety, in the men who lost jobs for daring to organise, in the women who said no more and were never heard from again. We forget sometimes how easily we look away, how comfortable the powerful become when they can ignore suffering. Victorian London teaches us this. Poverty doesn't disappear when it's hidden, it festers, it shapes the soul of a city, and it demands to be seen, so we remember. Not to romanticize the past, but to face it. To look straight at the filth and the fight and the impossible beauty of those who endured. We remember the ragpickers and the match girls, the orphans and the dockers, the mothers with ash-stained hands and the children who laughed in the rain. We remember because their story isn't over. It's written still, in quiet corners and crowded flats and meals stretched thin. They survived. Not because they were given much, but because they refused to vanish, and their voices, though faint, still rise in the smoke.